I signed a non-disclosure agreement 12 years ago in a cold, windowless room. They told me if I ever spoke about what happened in Sector 4, I would lose my pension, my freedom, or worse. I don't care anymore. The guilt is heavier than the fear. The colorful tourist maps they hand out at the visitor centers are complete lies. There are massive, undocumented zones within our national parks, areas that are heavily classified, chained off, and entirely scrubbed from the public record. We were strictly forbidden from going anywhere near them. The veteran rangers, the guys who had been stationed out in the deep woods for decades, they knew exactly what was living on the other side of those rusted iron boundaries. And the most terrifying part? They just let it hunt. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. When I first joined the Forestry Service, I thought my job was to protect the wildlife from careless people. I didn't realize my actual duty was to protect the public from something older and far more dangerous than anything in the natural world. I broke the one golden rule every senior officer warned me about. I crossed the black boundary line. I thought I was saving someone. But the thing that was mimicking the screams of a missing hiker in the dark, the thing that I chased into the dead zone, it wasn't human. And it didn't just stay in the woods. It remembered my face. When you first get your badge, the reality of the job is incredibly mundane. It isn't all dramatic helicopter rescues or wrestling rogue bears. It is 90% paperwork and babysitting tourists who think a wild mountain lion is just a large petting zoo animal. My first few months were spent clearing fallen branches off the main hiking trails, replacing SD cards in motion sensor trail cameras that only ever captured raccoons and lost deer, and memorizing standard 10 codes, 10 to 4 inches for acknowledged, 10 to 23 inches for arrived at the scene, 10 to 46 inches for a stranded motorist. It was monotonous, predictable work. You get used to the heavy, scratchy uniform, the constant smell of pine needles, bug spray, and the stale black coffee in the station break room. You learn how to deal with twisted ankles, heat exhaustion, and stolen camp coolers. It felt safe. It felt normal. But there was always a strange, unsettling disconnect between us rookies and the veterans. The guys who had been out there for 20, 30 years. Men like old Ranger Miller, who had skin like weathered leather and eyes that constantly scanned the tree line, even when he was safely indoors. They didn't smile much. They compulsively locked doors, double-checked window latches, and never stayed out on the trails after dusk unless it was an absolute, undeniable emergency. And even then, they always went out in pairs, carrying heavy-caliber rifles that they officially weren't supposed to have in their trucks. I used to think they were just paranoid, burnt out from years of isolation. I thought the deep wilderness had just chipped away at their social skills. I was incredibly naive. The first time I saw the master map in the supervisor's office, I noticed a massive, irregular blank spot in the deep northern quadrant. It wasn't labeled as a conservation area, a logging zone, or dangerous terrain. It was just shaded in a dense, dark gray. When I asked about it, the ambient chatter in the room went dead silent. Supervisor Harris, a man who usually commanded the station with a booming voice, lowered his tone to a tense whisper. He told me it was Sector 4. The veterans just called it the Black Boundary. He took me out there the very next day in his cruiser, driving miles past the public access roads, deep into the old-growth forest where the canopy was so thick it actually blocked out the afternoon sun. We stopped at a dead-end dirt turnaround. He stepped out and pointed deep into the woods. About 50 yards in, I saw them, massive, rusted iron chains. The links thicker than my own wrist, wrapped tightly around the trunks of ancient, rotting pine trees. They stretched as far as the eye could see in either direction, drawing a jagged, metallic line through the forest floor. It didn't look like a standard property line or a wildlife fence. It looked like a barricade. It looked like they were trying to keep something in. Harris didn't look at the chains. He looked at me, dead in the eyes, and gave me the rule. The only rule that actually mattered out here. You are going to patrol this perimeter twice a week, he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any emotion or warmth. You do it at high noon. You check the chains from a distance to make sure they haven't been snapped. But listen to me very carefully. If you are ever delayed, if your truck breaks down, Or if you find yourself out here when the sun goes down, you roll up your windows and you lock yourself in the cab. I don't care if you hear a woman screaming for help. I don't care if you hear a lost child crying for its mother in the dark. I don't care if you hear my voice calling your name over your radio. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. No matter what you hear coming from that sector after dusk, you do not unclip your radio to respond. You do not step out of your vehicle. And you never, ever shine your flashlight into that tree line. If you do, whatever is in there will see you, and you won't be coming back to the station. It was mid-October when I drew the late afternoon perimeter check for the northern quadrant. The autumn air was unusually bitter that year, carrying a biting chill that seeped straight through my uniform jacket. By 5 o'clock, a thick, milky fog had begun rolling down from the higher elevations, swallowing the trunks of the ancient pines and reducing visibility to less than 30 feet. I was running behind schedule. A washed-out dirt road had forced me to take a long detour, and by the time my cruiser's headlights swept over the dead-end turnaround facing Sector 4, the sun had already dipped below the jagged mountain ridge. The fading twilight cast long, skeletal shadows across the rusted iron chains. I should have turned the truck around right then. I should have logged the perimeter as visually cleared and driven back to the warmth of the station. But as I shifted into reverse, the radio on my dashboard crackled to life. It wasn't the standard burst of static followed by dispatch. It was a sharp, high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache, followed by heavy, wet breathing. I froze, my hand hovering over the gear shift. Then, a voice broke through the white noise. It was a little girl. She was sobbing, her voice trembling with a pure, unfiltered terror that made my blood run entirely cold. "Please," she choked out, the audio clipping as if she were speaking directly into the microphone. "Please, I'm so cold, my leg is stuck. Mommy left, and the tall man is looking for me." I stared at the radio, my heart hammering against my ribs. We hadn't had a report of a missing child in months. The last one was a 7-year-old girl named Abigail, who had vanished near the eastern hiking trails almost 10 years ago. They never found her. But the voice on the radio was so clear, so immediate, it didn't make any sense. My hand instinctively shot to the mic clipped to my shoulder. I pressed the transmission button. "This is Ranger Unit 7. I hear you. What is your location? Can you see any landmarks?" I waited, the silence in the cab deafening. 10 seconds passed. Then the radio crackled again. The exact same heavy, wet breathing. The exact same pitch and cadence. "Please, please, I'm so cold. My leg is stuck. Mommy left, and the tall man is looking for me." It was an identical replication. The pauses, the inflection, the slight crack in her voice on the word mommy. It was a perfect, impossible loop, like a pre-recorded tape being played back over the frequency. Supervisor Harris's warning echoed in my mind. "I don't care if you hear a lost child crying for its mother in the dark." I knew the rules. I knew I was supposed to lock the doors and drive away. But human instinct is a dangerous, overpowering thing. You cannot sit in a warm truck and listen to a child beg for her life in the freezing woods, not when you swore an oath to protect them. I convinced myself it was a prank. Teenagers with a ham radio messing with the park frequencies. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had genuinely stumbled into Sector 4 and was hurt? I grabbed my heavy flashlight from the center console, unholstered my service weapon, and pushed the truck door open. The cold air hit me like a physical blow. The fog was so dense now that it felt like moving through damp cotton. I walked slowly toward the tree line, my boots crunching loudly against the gravel. The iron chains loomed ahead, slick with condensation, looking like the spine of some massive, buried beast. The radio clipped to my shoulder hissed again, delivering that same looped, sobbing plea. It was coming from just beyond the barrier. I stood at the edge, staring into the impenetrable blackness between the trees. My hands were shaking. I took a deep breath, raised my boots, and stepped over the heavy rusted iron. My foot hit the soft, damp soil of Sector 4. The very second my weight shifted onto that ground, the world changed. It wasn't a gradual transition. It was an instant, violent cessation of reality. The howling wind cutting through the branches, the chirping of evening crickets, the distant rush of the river. It all vanished in a fraction of a second. It was like a heavy, soundproof vault door had been slammed shut behind me. The silence was absolute, oppressive, and heavy. It pressed against my eardrums with a physical weight, making me feel dizzy. I turned around to look back at my cruiser, parked just 15 feet away, but the fog had thickened into a solid gray wall. I couldn't see the truck. I couldn't even see the rusted chains I had just stepped over. I was entirely cut off. And then, from deep within the suffocating silence of the dead zone, I heard the crunch of a dry branch snapping under a very heavy, two-legged stride. I stood completely frozen, gripping the heavy metal chassis of my flashlight so tightly that the knuckles of my right hand throbbed with a dull, pulsing ache. The silence was so profound and absolute that I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that seemed entirely too loud for this lifeless, hollow place. I reached down to my tactical belt, my fingers fumbling blindly against the nylon pouches until they found the heavy brass compass I always carried for deep woods navigation. I unclasped it, bringing the glass dial close to my face in the dim, suffocating gray light. The needle wasn't pointing north. It wasn't pointing anywhere. It was spinning in slow, deliberate, uninterrupted circles, grinding against the housing with a faint metallic scrape that sent a shiver straight down my spine. Space itself felt fundamentally broken here. When I took a hesitant, trembling step forward, the ground beneath my heavy boots felt entirely wrong. It was too spongy, too yielding, like walking across the surface of a massive, rotting lung. I tried to mentally retrace my steps, calculating that I had only walked perhaps 20 or 30 feet from the rusted iron chains. But as I glanced around, the geometry of the forest seemed to stretch, warp, and distort in ways my brain could not properly process. The trees were clustered too close together in some places and impossibly far apart in others, creating forced perspectives that made my head spin with vertigo. Time felt thick, viscous, and entirely untethered from reality. I had no idea if I had been standing in that spot for 3 minutes or 3 hours. The milky fog didn't drift or swirl on the wind. There was no wind. The vapor hung perfectly stagnant, suspended in the dead air like dirty water in a neglected fish tank. I swept my flashlight beam across the nearest tree trunk, and a wave of pure, visceral nausea washed over me. These were not the ancient, towering pines that dominated the rest of the national park. The trunks were grotesquely twisted, spiraling upward in agonizing, tortured contortions. Their bark possessed an ashen, pallid color that looked less like wood and more like dead, desiccated flesh pulled tight over bone. Deep, jagged fissures ran vertically up the trunks, resembling open wounds, and from these lacerations seeped a thick, viscous black sap. It wasn't normal tree resin. It dripped down the pale bark in slow, heavy, bubbling beads, pooling at the swollen roots like congealing blood. The smell hit me then, creeping past the collar of my uniform, an overpowering, suffocating stench of raw ozone, old copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like decaying meat left out in the baking summer sun. It coated the back of my throat, making my eyes water and forcing me to gag into my sleeve. I raised the beam higher, trying to find the canopy, hoping to see even a single star or a patch of the night sky, but the branches twisted inward, knotting together into a dense, suffocating ceiling that blocked out the heavens completely. I unholstered my service weapon, clicking the safety off with a sharp metallic snap. In the dead vacuum of the woods, the small click sounded as loud as a gunshot. I called out, my voice sounding incredibly thin, weak, and entirely alien to my own ears. "Is anyone there? Forestry Service." The words didn't echo. They didn't bounce off the trees. They were instantly swallowed by the fog, dropping dead into the dirt the very moment they left my trembling lips. I pushed forward, driven by a morbid, pulling sensation in the center of my chest, a terrible instinct forcing my legs to move deeper into the rot. After what felt like miles of wandering blindly through the suffocating gray labyrinth, the twisted trees suddenly parted to reveal a massive, sunken clearing. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching violently in my throat. Spread out across the massive depression in the earth was a campsite. But it wasn't just one or two lost hikers' tents. There were dozens of them, arranged in a chaotic, overlapping, haphazard circle. I slowly walked down into the clearing, sweeping my flashlight over the damp canvas. The gear was impossibly, undeniably old. Heavy, olive-drab canvas A-frame tents from the late 1970s, rusted green Coleman lanterns, external frame aluminum backpacks with faded, moldy canvas straps. It looked as though a massive, organized search party or an entire scout troop had simply vanished into thin air. But what terrified me the most, the detail that made my stomach aggressively turn in on itself, was the unnatural preservation. Despite being clearly decades old, the tents weren't rotting away. The fabric wasn't torn by foraging bears or coyotes. There were no fallen branches crushing the fragile aluminum poles. It was as if this entire clearing existed in an airtight vacuum, entirely untouched by the harsh elements of the wilderness or the relentless passage of time. I approached a faded yellow dome tent, its zipper hanging half open. Inside, a plaid sleeping bag was neatly rolled out. A vintage thermos sat perfectly upright next to a pair of old scuffed leather hiking boots. It was perfectly staged, too perfect. A chilling realization began to creep up the back of my neck, raising the hairs on my arms. This wasn't a lost, abandoned campsite. This was a collection, a museum of the missing, carefully and methodically arranged by something that didn't understand human behavior, but knew exactly what human belongings looked like. I backed away from the yellow tent, my boot sinking deeply into a patch of soft, exposed mud near what used to be a large stone fire pit. I glanced down, and the beam of my flashlight caught a clear, distinct set of tracks pressed into the earth. My pulse skyrocketed, hammering against my ribs. They were incredibly fresh. The sharp edges of the mud were still slowly collapsing inward, filling with black water. I crouched down, keeping my gun leveled at the dark, impenetrable tree line, and studied the deep impressions. At first glance, they looked like standard, heavy-duty hiking boots, perhaps a men's size 10 or 11. I traced the line of tracks with my light as they led away from the fire pit and toward the wall of twisted, bleeding trees. But as my eyes followed them, the shape of the footprints began to change. Over the span of about 20 yards, the distinct manufactured rubber tread of the boot began to warp and elongate in the mud. The heel narrowed into a sharp, unnatural point. The front of the print widened grotesquely, splitting apart into distinct digits. By the time the tracks reached the edge of the clearing, they were no longer human. They were massive, barefoot impressions, easily 18 inches long, ending in 4 deep gouging claw marks that had ripped through the thick roots and torn the earth to shreds. My stomach plummeted, the icy dread finally crystallizing in my veins and paralyzing my muscles. The voice on the radio, the little girl crying for her mother in the dark. It hadn't been a distress call. It was a lure. I looked around at the perfectly preserved tents, the dead, twisted trees, and the impossible silence of the suffocating fog. I wasn't the search party. I had never been the search party. I was the bait, and I had walked willingly into the trap. The realization hit me with the physical force of a freight train. I scrambled backward, desperately trying to put distance between myself and those deformed, shifting footprints, my heavy boots slipping uncontrollably on the rotting, spongy earth. As I stumbled, the final, bruised purple light of the evening sun was violently extinguished, plunging the twisted forest into absolute, impenetrable darkness. There was a suffocating blackness, the kind that presses physically against your open eyes and makes you dizzy with intense vertigo. My heavy-duty issued flashlight was the only thing cutting a narrow, fragile beam through the oppressive, milky fog. And then, the beam began to stutter. The solid, bright white circle of LED light suddenly dimmed to a sick, jaundiced yellow, buzzing with a faint electrical hum. I smacked the heavy metal casing violently against the palm of my hand, panic rising hot and sharp in the back of my throat. The batteries were brand new. I had checked them myself before starting my shift. The light flickered again, plunging me into pitch black for a terrifying, agonizing 3 seconds before stuttering back to a weak, trembling glow. In those 3 seconds of total darkness, the dead silence of the forbidden forest was finally broken. It started as a heavy, wet compression of mud and dead leaves, about 50 feet to my left, completely hidden behind the thick veil of fog and deformed trunks. Crunch, squelch. I froze, holding my breath, my service weapon leveled with a violently shaking grip toward the unseen sound. The noise stopped the exact fraction of a second I did. I took a slow, agonizing step backward. Crunch, squelch. It matched my pace perfectly. I took 2 rapid, panicked steps to the right. Crunch, crunch. It mirrored me again. The strides were impossibly long, the sheer weight of the thing shifting the earth with a terrifying, heavy finality that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It wasn't just following me, it was mocking me. It was playing with its food before the slaughter. My chest heaved as hyperventilation began to set in, ragged, terrified gasps of air tearing through my clenched teeth. And then, from the impenetrable darkness just beyond my failing flashlight beam, I heard my own breathing echo back at me. It wasn't an acoustic echo bouncing off the trees. It was a deliberate, wet replication of my ragged gasps, amplified and distorted, sounding like it was being pushed through a crushed, mucus-filled throat. Then, it whispered. It wasn't the little girl anymore. It was my own voice, shivering with unadulterated terror, perfectly replicating the panicked prayers I hadn't even realized I was whispering under my breath. Oh God, please no, please no. The mimicry was absolutely flawless, yet utterly devoid of any soul or humanity. My finger tightened instinctively on the trigger. Show yourself, I screamed, the desperate command shattering the heavy, suffocating air. The flashlight died completely. Total, crushing darkness swallowed me whole. I screamed again, smacking the flashlight violently against the side of my tactical belt. 1, 2, 3 agonizing seconds of blind, suffocating terror. The light violently sparked back to life with a blinding white flash. The beam cut through the thick fog and hit something standing less than 20 feet away. My brain instantly, violently rejected what my eyes were seeing. It was towering, easily pushing 10 feet in height, its smooth, hairless head scraping against the lower, twisted branches of the dead canopy. It was impossibly, grotesquely thin, its pale limbs stretched and pulled like warm taffy, ending in those massive, 4-fingered claws I had seen gouged into the mud. Its skin was the sickening color of drowned, waterlogged flesh, pulled so tight over its ribcage that the jagged bones looked ready to snap through the membrane. But it was the face that broke my mind completely. It had no mouth, no nose, just smooth, dead skin, save for 2 glowing, hollow, moon-pale eyes that locked directly onto mine. They burned with an ancient, predatory malice, a cold, calculating intelligence that completely understood my terror and thoroughly savored it. It didn't roar. It didn't snarl. It simply tilted its massive head with a sickening, wet crack of its vertebrae and whispered in my exact voice, "Found you." My mind violently shattered. I didn't think, I just pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the 9mm tore through the dead silence, the intense muzzle flash temporarily blinding me. I emptied the entire magazine directly into its center mass, the hot brass casings ejecting and burning into the mud. The entity didn't even flinch. It didn't stagger or bleed. It simply took one massive, ground-shaking step forward. I dropped the dead flashlight, spun around, and ran. I sprinted into the blinding, suffocating darkness with a primal, desperate speed I didn't know my body possessed. Unseen, jagged branches whipped across my face, tearing the skin, warm blood running down my cheeks and blinding my left eye. Thick, knotted roots caught my heavy boots, but I scrambled on all fours, tearing my fingernails on the jagged rocks, absolutely refusing to stay down. The heavy, booming footsteps thundered right behind me, tearing through the trees, snapping massive trunks like they were dry, brittle twigs. It was gaining on me effortlessly. The wet, ragged sound of my own voice laughing hysterically chased me through the dark, right on my heels, the freezing, putrid breath of the thing chilling the sweat on the back of my neck. My lungs burned like they were filled with shattered glass. I was going to die here in the dark. Through the blinding panic and the tearing pain, my shin slammed into something hard, cold and entirely metallic. I crashed entirely over it, plummeting face first into the dirt, tasting copper and dead leaves. I lay there in the freezing mud, gasping for air, waiting for the massive claws to rip into my back. But the impact never came. The oppressive, suffocating silence had suddenly shattered. I could hear the wind howling through the pine branches again. I could hear the distant, rushing water of the river. I rolled onto my back, my chest heaving, and looked down at what I had crashed over. It was the heavy, rusted iron chain. I had fallen back across the black boundary line. I dragged myself backward through the dirt, keeping my empty weapon aimed at the dark tree line, until my arms went completely numb and the morning sky slowly turned a bruised, pale gray. By sunrise, the thick fog finally began to lift. That is when Supervisor Harris and Old Ranger Miller found me. They were sweeping the dirt road in a cruiser, driving at a crawl. Miller jumped out, his heavy rifle instantly raised to his shoulder, but he stopped dead in his tracks when he looked at me. He didn't look at my bleeding face or my violently torn uniform. He looked directly at my boots. He saw the thick, black, foul-smelling mud caked halfway up my shins. All the color drained instantly from his weathered, leathery face. He slowly lowered his rifle, looked back at Harris in the driver's seat, and just shook his head. They didn't ask me what happened. They didn't ask if I was hurt. They knew. I was immediately pulled from active duty. I wasn't even taken back to the ranger station to clean up. I was driven straight to a windowless administrative building 3 towns over. 2 men in unbranded, cheap gray suits were waiting for me in a sterile room. The interrogation lasted for 14 agonizing hours. They didn't record the conversation, and they didn't take notes. They just pushed a massive stack of non-disclosure agreements across the cold metal table and told me, in a very calm, flat tone, that if I ever breathed a single word about Sector 4, I would simply disappear. I was forced to take an early, completely silent retirement, and was relocated across the country by the end of the week. I have spent the last 12 years looking over my shoulder, compulsively checking the locks on my doors, absolutely terrified of the dark. So please, listen to me very carefully. If you are ever hiking in the deep woods and the natural ambient sounds of the forest suddenly go dead silent, do not stop walking. If you hear a woman screaming for help, or a lost child crying out for its mother, or a familiar voice calling your specific name from the tree line, do not look back. Keep your eyes locked on the trail in front of you, and run. Because whatever is waiting for you in the dark, it is not a person, and it is hungry.